So much for having me. It's an honor to meet new communities every time I get a chance to do so. I was asked to speak about from inspiration to action, and I just want to offer a few words first about action and the need for action and kind of where we are as a society and as a species. I live in Oakland, and I got home last night at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and I noticed just 1 block away from my house, there were about 12 police cars. They had kind of cordoned off an entire block, and there was the SWAT team was there. They had their big black bulletproof armored vehicle, and there was a standoff, someone that they were looking for, and it had already been going on for about an hour when I got home. And so I was talking to some of my neighbors who were hanging out outside, just trying to understand what was going on. And I watched this thing unfold for another 3 hours or so. And luckily, nobody was harmed, nobody was shot that I know of. And it kind of de-escalated and went away. But this is what I came home to. That was happening on one side of the block. And on the other side, I live 1 block away from International Boulevard in a neighborhood that has some of the highest rates of human trafficking. So every day I come home and I see women who are being trafficked, selling their bodies, even in the cold, even in the rain. About 2-3 blocks away from my house is a huge homeless encampment, which we're seeing more and more of in the Bay Area these days. And it's a homeless encampment that's experienced several fires over the last few months. One person was killed in one of the fires in his tent while he slept. I've also been thinking a lot about, I don't know how many of you have heard of the recent UN report on climate change that basically told us that we have 12 years to radically alter and transform our society before irreversible climate catastrophe. And those 12 years, it's not like we have 12 years and then in 12 years we have to figure out what to do. Right? It's that we have to figure out what to do now so that there isn't catastrophic climate emergencies 12 years from now. And those 12 years doesn't take into account that the new president of Brazil is planning on selling off the entire Amazon. And if that happens, of course, that shortens our timeline. I have a friend and colleague named Chris Moore-Backman who's currently working on writing an article for Yes Magazine called Climate Honesty is Spiritual Practice. That it actually takes spiritual practice to really come to terms with the depth of the catastrophe that we're facing, to really come to terms with where we are as a human species. That we actually don't have time for small nonprofit organizations to be waging campaign after campaign after campaign to win one piece of legislation. That if we're really honest with ourselves, and if we're really honest as a society, as a species, what we need right now is nothing short of revolution. And I really want us to let that sink in, just the significance of this moment in human history, and the need to act, not just to be inspired by spiritual teachings, not just to be inspired by our meditation practices, but to act in a significant way. Several years ago, I got an opportunity to meet a gentleman named Ivan Marovich. Ivan is a revolutionary in so many ways. Ivan is the co-founder of Otpor. Otpor is the student-led nonviolent revolution that brought down the dictatorship of Slobodan Milosevic in Yugoslavia. And I was talking to him several years ago after a workshop had ended, and we were hanging out outside of Campfire, and we were just exchanging stories. And Ivan was telling me about what he did in his life after the revolution. And he used those words. He said, yeah, after the revolution, my partner and I moved to Kenya and we started doing these projects. And it was a comment that he made in passing, but I kind of paused him. And I said, hold on, Ivan. You just said after the revolution. And it hit me in that moment that we use the word revolutionary to mean many different things in our lives and in our society. And I realized in that moment that it was the first time in my life that I was talking to an actual literal revolutionary, someone who had led an actual revolution. And it was deeply inspiring. And I found myself telling Ivan, I want to be able to say that at some point. I want to be able to say that at some point, like after the revolution, after the transition, after the transformation, I did so-and-so. But what scares me right now is an acknowledgement that what we need right now is even bigger than what Yvonne did. Because what we need right now isn't just the toppling of an empire, but it's a revolution in values, right? And a revolution in how we relate to each other as human beings, a revolution in how we relate to ourselves, a revolution in how we relate to the earth and to land. And those are much more complicated things to figure out how to do than just to point our finger at one person or one system and to try to topple that. It's much more complicated. You know, in kind of, if you compare those two, it's much easier to bring down a government than it is to transform an entire society and our way of relating to each other. Over the last 20 years or so, I've been involved in a lot of social change movements that have tried to topple systems. I don't know how many of you remember, I think it was about 3 years ago maybe, a group of activists shut down the San Francisco Bay Bridge for about an hour on Martin Luther King Day. And I was on that bridge that day. And I had some hesitations about that action. From a tactical and strategic standpoint, I wasn't sure if that was the best thing to do. But also from a principled approach, something about that action didn't fully resonate with me. But so much of the movement for Black Lives is to support the leadership of African American communities that are on the front lines. And so I put my hesitation aside and I supported that action best way I knew how, and I was on that bridge. And I've been part of many campaigns like this, right? I've been part of many movements, been part of many actions like this. And there's something in my heart that never quite resonated. At the same time, right now I'm currently in the process of helping to facilitate a dialogue between a mother and an incarcerated person who murdered her son. And they're both in a place where they want to come together and have a dialogue about reconciliation and about healing and about being able to forgive and to move forward. Just last Sunday, I was at Valley State Prison, about 2.5 hours away from here, and we had a closing circle, a graduation, for a restorative justice group that we've been facilitating for 1.5 years. And this is a group of about 20 men who all have a history of sexual violence. And we shared stories over the last 1.5 years of, there's something like so intimate and something so core about people talking about harms that they've both experienced and that they've perpetrated, things that they've never talked about before, things that they've been holding and repressing in their hearts for 20, 30 years, and creating a container that's safe enough for men to talk about those experiences, knowing that they're not going to be shunned, knowing that they're not going to be outcasted. And it builds an incredible level of trust and intimacy and safety. It's hard for me to comprehend. Like, I've heard some of the most horrific stories you could possibly ever imagine. And through those stories of harm, we've been able to build some of the safest containers I've ever experienced in my life. And I share this because doing this kind of work in the prisons, or this kind of healing and reconciliatory work in the prisons, has been such a privilege because it has allowed me to meet some people who have experienced and perpetuated some of the grossest acts of violence you could possibly ever imagine, some of the worst things that we can do to each other as human beings. And yet, these men have come to the other end of those experiences and are now some of the most loving, most committed peacemakers I have ever known. And I've known a lot of them. And that kind of experience really shows me what's possible with human beings, like the depth of healing that we are capable of. It shows me the possibility of our resilience, that if someone can bounce back from those types of life experiences and end up becoming some of the most compassionate, loving peacemakers I've ever known, then what are we not capable of? And I believe that change is fractal in nature. And what I mean by that is, I think that the possibilities as well as the principles that apply in self-transformation, those same principles and those same possibilities are present in healing and transforming conflict between two individuals. And it's those same principles that apply in healing conflicts between communities and conflicts between nations. And I believe that if that level and that depth of healing is possible between one person or between two people, then how can we make that kind of transformation happen at scale? And over the last couple of years, that's what I've really been grappling with, is the depth of healing that I've had the privilege to witness in prison. How can we make that happen in public? I understand that in order for us to create the level of transformation that our society needs, it's not enough just for us to pray and to meditate. That we actually do need to escalate our tactics so that we can harness enough power so that we can make change. That we need to be doing things that we did in Standing Rock and occupying land. That we actually need to be occupying highways and shutting down government meetings and the like. But is there a way that we can do that while being deeply grounded in an intention of love and an intention of healing? And can we actually use tactics that shut down highways and bridges with the intention of opening up our hearts? And what does that even look like to build a movement that has the capacity to harness the power that is garnered when we're able to shut down a highway or to occupy a public space while being deeply grounded in love and healing and reconciliation? Dr. Martin Luther King reminded us that power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. That when we occupy a highway or when we shut down the San Francisco Bay Bridge and we're not deeply grounded in love as we do that, that action, even if it's for the purpose of justice, that it can be destructive and it can destroy relationships. And at the same time, if all we're doing is practicing metta meditation and cultivating love, and we're not going into our communities and acting, then that love is sentimental and it's weak. It may make us feel better, but it's not challenging the systems of power that are hurting our people. And so what we need is a movement that has the capacity to hold the synergy of power and love. And it's a movement that I don't know that I've ever been a part of. Like, I've seen glimpses of it. I saw glimpses of it when I was at Standing Rock. I saw a glimpse of it in the early days of the Occupy movement. But these things are so hard to hold the complexity of power and love together that it tends to fall apart relatively quickly. So it's what I've been grappling with over the last couple of years is how can we build a movement that sustains the power of both? Just last week, actually just today's Sunday, just on Friday night, I came home from a week-long gathering of a group of activists from around the country that's really grappling with this question. And it gives me a lot of hope to be in community with people who are really, like, there's some people who, one person is the granddaughter of a Gandhian activist who was beaten and jailed for 4 years during the campaign in India. Another man who has already served 2 years in prison for an action that he did to protect climate and to protect land. And to be in a community of people who are really grappling with the fact that the level of transformation that we need in our society is going to involve some real sacrifices. And what does that mean for us to be in community where we're grappling with that question of what sacrifices are we going to have to make to really create the transformation that we need in our society? But I want to take a step back and share a little bit about my own personal path, my own personal journey of how I got to the stage. I was sharing right before we got started that I was actually born in Tokyo. I was born in Japan. And I was born into a pretty wealthy and powerful family. My great-grandfather on my mother's side started a women's university, which is now one of the biggest women's universities in Japan, called Showa Joshi Daigaku. And so I was born very comfortable. I was born into a family where I didn't understand the privilege that I had because it was just what I was born into. I didn't understand that there was anything unique, not just about regular family vacations to Hawaii, but the fact that my father owned a condo in Hawaii that we would visit all the time, right? I didn't understand how privileged I was. But when I was 7 years old, my father was caught embezzling money from the school that he was working at. And so he had to leave the country. and we ended up in the United States. At the time, my father and my mother kept that from us, the reason why we moved, so I thought we were just coming to the United States on vacation. They never even had the conversation with us about, hey, we're moving to this country, because they thought that things would eventually quiet down and we'd be able to go back to Japan, and 30 years later, here we are still. And things got different. Things got very difficult in my life very quickly. My father ended up dying of cancer when I was 11 years old. And we were undocumented after that because my father's visa was the reason why we were able to stay. So when he passed away, the visa passed with him. My mother ended up in a green card marriage with a man who turned out to be very abusive and brought a lot of harm and a lot of chaos into my family. And I was about 11, 12 years old when everything started to shift. We were homeless for a while. We went from living in a multi-million-dollar mansion to being homeless within a couple of years. And as a small child, I didn't know how to deal with that. I didn't know what was going on. I started to see the abuse in my family. And so, like many young people, I was lost, and I turned to drugs and alcohol. By the time I was 14, I was skipping school and getting drunk in the park. At the age of 15, I dropped out of high school. And for the next 2 years, from 15 to 17, I was just completely lost. And I oftentimes say that at that point in my life, I think in the same ways that it is for a lot of young people, if I had met a military recruiter, I would have easily gone off to war. And if I had gone off to war, I could have very easily come back from that experience and become a cop or a prison guard. Maybe I would have kind of been surrounded by that type of environment and ended up becoming a Trump supporter. It very easily could have happened. At that point, if I had met a cult leader, could have very easily joined a cult. And who knows where that path might have taken me. I was so lost that any person, that like the first person that reached their hand out to give me some sense of purpose and some sense of community, I probably would have gone with. And luckily for me, it wasn't a military recruiter. It wasn't a cult leader. It was a group of Japanese Buddhist monastics. A Japanese Buddhist order called Nippon Zammyo Hoji. It's an order that grew out of the time in post-war Japan where a lot of these like peace-based new religions were forming. This is an order that's really dedicated to nonviolence and really dedicated to social change work. And they were organizing at the time a walking pilgrimage. They were going to walk from Massachusetts to New Orleans and then walk down the coast of Africa to retrace the Middle Passage, to retrace the legacy of slavery in this country. Because there was an acknowledgement that if we're going to heal the wounds of racism that we deal with in this country today, we can't do that unless we go all the way back and heal the legacy of slavery and to heal the legacy of the genocide of indigenous peoples. So for them, it was a spiritual pilgrimage where every step that they took was a physical prayer. And they were going to try to heal the wounds of the 500-year legacy of colonialism and racism in this country. And as a 17-year-old kid who had never been involved in any sort of activism or anything like that, I had no idea. I couldn't even possibly begin to imagine just the grandeur of that vision. But for me, it was a way out. Right? I heard about this walk a week before it started, and I was like, I'm bored. I heard it was a drug and alcohol-free walk. So I told myself it'd be good for me to sober up for a little while. So I told my mom that I'm going to check this thing out. I'll be back in a week. And I didn't come home for a year and a half. I still remember on the third day of that walk, it's one of those memories that I don't know how much of it is real and how much of it is this like fantasy I've made in my head. But I feel like I still remember on the third day of that walk, like I can almost see my foot, one step in front of the other, the moment that it hit me that this is where I'm meant to be. And so I ended up going all the way to New Orleans with these monks on that walk. And then one of the nuns from that order kind of took me under her wing. And after we got to New Orleans, she invited me to go to their monasteries in Nepal, in Lumbini, to help with the construction of the world's biggest peace pagoda, this massive pagoda dedicated to world peace. And so I, at the time, I had no idea what Nepal was. I had no idea where in the world it was. I didn't know what language they spoke. I knew nothing about it, but I bought a one-way ticket and I was gone because I just knew that that's where my heart was calling. And so I ended up spending a year living in Buddhist monasteries throughout India and Nepal, studying Buddhism and studying nonviolence under this order. And so when I came back from that order, I was on fire. I got involved in community activism. I got involved in various campaigns to free political prisoners. I got involved in the anti-global justice movement, or the global justice movement. And over the course of the next 10 years or so, I lived like a dual life, where I would go to these monasteries to practice my spiritual practice, and then I go over here to do my political activism. And it felt almost schizophrenic, because I had these like two deeply important parts of my life that I was always trying to find a way to create a synthesis for. And in the early days of my activism, I started facilitating nonviolence trainings, or so I thought. I was helping to lead trainings for hundreds of people, preparing them to go into demonstrations and protests. And after a couple of years of doing these trainings, I felt like something was missing in the work that I was doing. And so I couldn't quite place a finger on it, but I knew that something, like, we weren't getting to the depth of the conversations that we needed to get to. And so I couldn't quite understand it, but it was significant enough in my heart that I actually stopped facilitating these workshops. And for the next 8 years or so, 10 years, the word nonviolence had no relevance to me. I stayed involved in social change work and was involved in many different movements, but the word nonviolence meant nothing to me. And in 2008, I had the opportunity to attend a 2-day workshop called Kingian Nonviolence. Kingian Nonviolence Conflict Reconciliation. It was based on the teachings of Dr. Martin Luther King. And those 2 days completely changed my life. In those 2 days, I understood what was missing in the workshops that I was facilitating before. I realized that what I was doing before, I wasn't doing nonviolence trainings. What I was doing was nonviolent civil disobedience trainings. What I was doing was teaching people how to commit acts of civil disobedience without throwing a punch. And I had no idea the depth that is encompassed in the word nonviolence. I thought nonviolence was just about, as long as I don't throw a punch, then I'm practicing nonviolence. And in those 2 days, I was completely blown away by the depth of the philosophy of Dr. Martin Luther King. And a couple of months after that workshop, a young man named Oscar Grant was shot and killed about a mile from my house. So I dove into this. Oscar Grant, for those that may not know, I'm sure most people here know, was a young black man who was shot and killed by the BART police, by the transit police out here in Oakland, on New Year's morning of 2009. And it was the first time that a black man had been shot and killed by the police in that way, and it was captured on video. So that video went viral, and I ended up on the steering committee of the coalition that came together to respond to the shooting. And during that whole campaign, everything that I had just learned about nonviolence was like calling me from the depth of my heart, and I knew that more than anything, that what that movement needed was an understanding and a commitment to this newfound depth of nonviolence that I had just discovered. But having just taken this 2-day workshop, I couldn't quite articulate it. Like, I couldn't articulate to people why I felt it was so important to actually have compassion for the police officer who shot and killed Oscar Grant. I couldn't articulate why I felt that that was such a critical thing. And so the words were stumbling out of my mouth, and I became a very unpopular figure in many places in the movement. And so I realized that I needed to study this stuff more. And so that summer I went and got certified in this training curriculum called Kingian Nonviolence, and that's the work that I've largely been doing ever since. And one of the main things that I learned in Kingian Nonviolence is that the word nonviolence, like, the biggest misunderstanding of the concept of nonviolence is that nonviolence means to not be violent. I used to think that as long as I wasn't being violent, that as long as I wasn't throwing the punch, then I'm practicing nonviolence. And I think that is one of the biggest and most dangerous misunderstandings of the concept of nonviolence. And I'll share a little story about why I believe that's the case. Years ago, I was at my house, same place that I live now, and I was taking a nap. It was about 10 o'clock in the morning, and I'd gone back to sleep. And I live in a neighborhood where people screaming and yelling and arguing with each other is a very normal occurrence. It happens all the time. And so I was woken up by a commotion outside my house. There was a couple who were arguing and screaming at each other. And I was just trying to go back to sleep. This is just another day in the neighborhood. And this argument kept escalating, and it kept escalating, and it kept escalating. And I finally decided to get up out of my bed and look down the window. I live on the second floor, and right below my window, there was a woman on the ground who was getting beat. And she wasn't just getting beat, she was screaming for help. So I jumped up out of my bed, I put on my clothes, I put on my shoes, I ran downstairs, I opened up the gate, and by this point, the argument had gone across the street to the other corner, and it was still going on, and I ran across the street and I broke up this fight. And by the time I got down there, about 15 of my neighbors had all heard the commotion, and they had all come outside, and they were just standing around watching this woman get beat, not doing anything to help. And I always argue that all of my neighbors who were just watching this woman get beat were practicing nonviolence in the sense that they were not being violent, right? They weren't throwing the punches, they weren't throwing the kicks, they were explicitly being not violent. And in fact, you could even make the argument that I was more violent than my neighbors were because I used a limited amount of physical force to separate the two parties, and in doing so, I might have hurt some of them. So you see how big of a misunderstanding it can cause when we think nonviolence is about not doing something. When I learned from Dr. King is that nonviolence isn't about what we don't do. It's about when you see violence and when you see injustice and when you see people getting hurt, what are you going to do about it? Right? Like, what are we going to do to put ourselves in a situation where we can transform situations where people are being harmed? I was talking to Naren? Sorry. Before this, and he was sharing a little bit about the work that this community does, right? And it's not just about coming together to meditate, but it's about going out into the world and being of service. And one of my favorite quotes by Dr. Martin Luther King, of which I have many, one of my favorite quotes from Dr. Martin Luther King is when he said that when a religion, what was it? A religion that, I have too many favorite King quotes. Something along the lines of any religion that professes to be concerned about the souls of men and is not considered concerned about the economic and social realities that impact the soul is a spiritually morbid, a spiritually dead religion. That oftentimes the message that we get from a lot of religions and spiritual communities is that we know life is hard now, but just wait until you die and everything's going to be wonderful. You're going to go to heaven, you're going to be reborn, you're going to be able to move up the ladder, but just like deal with the suffering that you live with on this realm and keep praying to God, keep meditating, keep praying to Jesus, and once you die, life will be wonderful. And for Dr. King, that was not enough. That if we are saying that we're concerned about human beings' souls, then we need to be concerned about the impact that this realm has on our soul. And there's a level of suffering that impacts us on this physical realm that affects our souls. And if we're not dealing with healing that, then we are not practicing nonviolence, right? And so I want to share with the rest of my time a little bit about what's known as the 6 principles of Kingian nonviolence, which are kind of the foundation of the principles or the foundation of the philosophy of Kingian nonviolence. And if you ever have the opportunity to attend the 2-day workshops that we do on this, we spend about 4 hours, 5 hours exploring these 6 sentences. So there's a lot of depth to them. We got about a half hour left. So we'll try to rush through as many of these as we can. The first principle of nonviolence, of Kingian nonviolence, is that nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people. And the first part of this principle is that nonviolence is a way of life. That it's not something that we practice over here and then we don't practice over here. I've been part of countless movements, organizations, campaigns that call themselves nonviolent because we don't throw Molotov cocktails when we're out there protesting. But then when we're in the meetings organizing those protests, we're ripping each other apart, right? And that's not nonviolence in the way that Dr. King understood nonviolence, that if we're not practicing nonviolence in every interaction, then we're not really committed to the principles of nonviolence as a way of life. And also that nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people. Like, I work a lot in prisons and county jails and with a lot of high school students in urban communities where because they think nonviolence is about what not to do, there's a misconception that nonviolence is passive and that it's weak and it's about not doing something. But to actually take a stand against violence in a society where violence is the norm takes an incredible amount of courage. Every time I break up a fight outside of my house, I am scared because I have no idea what might happen to me. And yet, that's what courage is it's not about not being scared, but it's about acknowledging our fear and moving through it anyways. When I think about the crisis where we are in human history, if I'm really real with myself about that, I am scared beyond words about what might happen over the next 10, 15, 20 years. I'm scared for my 6-year-old nephew. I wonder if he's going to be able to live a whole happy life, because I don't think that's a guarantee anymore. And I think being real with where we are and how much harm is happening in our world is part of the courage that nonviolence calls us to. There's a nonviolence trainer that I work with in Soledad Prison. His name is Roy. Beautiful, beautiful soul. He's serving a life sentence for a homicide he committed as a young man. And he was talking about this principle one day when he was facilitating a workshop. And he said that it took me no courage to commit murder, because that was an act that was based entirely on fear. That the most courageous thing that he had ever done was to show up in a room full of incarcerated men fully as himself, all his faults, all his insecurities, all his fears, to speak to the things that he's most shameful of, to be his entire self. That was the most courageous thing that he had ever done. And he shared with us that the root of the word courage is the Latin word cor, which means heart. And he said that historically the original definition of that meant to show all of one's heart by speaking all of one's truth. That for us to speak to all of one's truth, our fears and our insecurities, the ways in which we are harmed, the ways in which we might have caused harm, is the most courageous thing that we can do. The second principle of nonviolence is the beloved community is the framework of the future. And the beloved community it's a term that is becoming more and more common today. It's a term that was first created by an American theologian in the 1920s named Josiah Royce, and Dr. King popularized it through a lot of his speeches. And a lot of people use the word beloved community to describe the communities that they are a part of. Their families, their network of friends, perhaps their spiritual communities. And I think it's important for us to celebrate the places where we do have that sort of loving community, because we don't celebrate enough. We don't acknowledge the privileges that we do have enough. So it's important that we celebrate all of that. And at the same time, when people say, oh, I have beloved community, it's my spiritual home, I want to push back and challenge them a little bit, because building beloved community is not about loving the people that are easy to love. It's not about loving the people that you're already in relationship with. That the challenge of building beloved community is about cultivating love and cultivating compassion for the people that we don't want to be hanging out with, the people that we disagree with, the people that we don't see eye to eye with. And this is one of the hardest things about nonviolence, a real principled commitment to nonviolence, is an acknowledgement that there is really nobody outside of beloved community. And I've spent 20 years in activism and social change work, where oftentimes a lot of us chant things like justice for all people. And so rarely do we actually mean all people. Because oftentimes when people say justice for all people, what we're really talking about is I want justice for all of my people. And oftentimes that justice for my people comes at the expense of those people over there. And there's a beautiful quote that comes from the Aboriginal communities in Australia that says, if you have come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you have come here because your liberation is bound with mine, then let us walk together. And this idea of collective liberation, mutual liberation, of interdependence is also very common in a lot of activist speak, in a lot of progressive communities. But I sometimes get the sense that people think that the universe weaves separate interwoven webs of dependence based on political affiliation. My liberation is bound with all of the liberation of people who vote Democrat. But the people who voted for Trump, that's a whole separate web of the universe. And to me, interdependence and collective liberation is something we either believe in or we don't. Right? We can't believe that my liberation is bound with your liberation because we're in this meditation community together, but screw those people over there. That's not how the universe works. Right? And we know that we're a long time away from that, which is why the beloved community is the framework of the future. It's really difficult for me to grapple visually with what does it look like to be in a community where all conflict between all communities historically have been reconciled. Because a lot of the conflicts that we deal with in our society today is 500 years in the making. So how do we heal a 500-year legacy of colonialism on this land? It's really hard to visualize. Thich Nhat Hanh has this quote where, I'm paraphrasing, but he says that when slaves were on the Underground Railroad, they were using the North Star as their guide. And they knew that no matter how far they walked, they were never going to get to the North Star. That wasn't the point. They knew that as long as they kept walking in the direction of the North Star, then they'd get to where they needed to go. And for me, the idea of beloved community, a fully reconciled world, I don't know intellectually if I believe that we'll ever get there, but that's not the point. It's the direction that we're walking in. And there's another incarcerated trainer from the same prison, Soledad, named Birju, who told me this one thing once. He said that resolving a conflict is about fixing issues, and reconciling a conflict is about repairing relationships. And oftentimes in our society, when there's a conflict between two people or between two communities, we figure out the bare minimum amount that we need to do to resolve the issue so the two people aren't at each other's throats fighting. But we never do the work of repairing the relationships that were harmed. And in nonviolence, the work isn't over until the relationship has been healed. And so criminal justice systems, lawsuits, changes in laws and policies, structures of governments, all of those things can change. Peace treaties between nations that were at war. That might end the process of two communities shooting at each other. But if we're not doing the hard work of repairing and mending the relationships, then there's always going to be conflict. And so beloved community is a commitment to mending relationships, not just fixing issues. And in order to get one step closer to that beloved community, the third principle of Kingian nonviolence is a critical practice. And the third principle is attack forces of evil, not persons doing evil. To attack injustice, not individuals. I was recently had the opportunity to travel to Boston, Massachusetts, near where I grew up. And I was doing trauma healing workshops for prison guards and for prison wardens. And it was a really insightful thing for me to realize, to hear their stories about how the system of prison that I'm so fundamentally opposed to, I think prisons do is more harm than they do good. And sometimes it's easy to think that, the prison guards are our enemies. I've had a lot of really difficult interactions with prison guards because a lot of them do not support the work that I do in there and view me as the enemy. And when that happens, it's easy for me to start seeing them as the enemy. And I know that a lot of the prison guards that I've interacted with are constantly abusing and harassing men that I've come to deeply love. And so it's hard, I should say it's easy, to start seeing them as the enemy. But in these trauma healing workshops, I got to hear their stories and to see the trauma that the system of prison imposes on them. And acknowledging that systems of violence hurt everybody. That if we are living in a society where injustice is the norm, where poverty is the norm, where a 76% recidivism rate in prisons is the norm, where a 50% dropout rate in the high schools in Oakland is the norm, where tens of thousands of people starving to death every day in the world is the norm, those systems don't serve anybody. And we like to set up this dichotomy. I think it gives us some sense of security to know that we're the good people and those are the bad people over there, right? It's very simple, it's very clear. We get to feel like we're the good people. But part of a commitment to building beloved community is acknowledging that people are not the enemy, that violence and injustice is the enemy. So what kind of practices are we doing in our own communities, in our own social movements, where we can cultivate compassion even for those that are committing acts of harm? In restorative justice work, there's a common saying that hurt people, that when we're holding on to pain that we haven't healed through, that we enact that pain out on someone else. When we have too much pain that have gone unprocessed, we process it onto someone else and we hurt others. But I've also found in hearing a lot of these stories from incarcerated people that it's not just that hurt people, that there's a flip side to that. And it's that hurting people hurts. That I've come to believe that it's not possible for a human being to cause harm onto another living being without that somehow destroying our own soul, right? Without that somehow damaging our own hearts. And so when I look at someone like some of these abusive prison guards, or even our current president, I'm not a citizen, so technically he's not my president. I like to kind of hold on to that. But when I look at someone like Donald Trump, whose policies are causing a lot of harm, I see a broken human being who is so far from fulfilling his potential as a human being, who seems to have this depth, this huge well of despair and insecurity and isolation in his own heart, that he needs to constantly be receiving positive feedback, that he needs to believe that he's the most popular president in the history of the world, that he's the most productive president in the history of the world. And while I can be in communities where we're resisting a lot of the policies that he's pushing for, that is causing harm, that I can also at the same time have some compassion in my heart for the brokenness that he is showing up in. The fourth principle of Kingian nonviolence is accept suffering without retaliation for the sake of the cause to achieve the goal, which is a bit of a mouthful. I'm not familiar with the type of meditation that this community leads, but I'm a practitioner of Vipassana meditation. I'm about to go to another retreat in January. And for those that have gone to those kinds of retreats, you know that it is really not fun. And it involves a lot of suffering. 10 hours of meditation a day is not fun. It hurts. And not only is it physically difficult and painful, but a lot of difficult emotions come up also. But it's like any growth involves some level of suffering. Like growth hurts. And in nonviolence, we acknowledge that to make the level of transformation that our society needs to manifest that level of transformation is going to involve a lot of sacrifice on our part. And a lot of people say, well, nonviolence isn't fair because you can't ask marginalized communities who are rising up for their own liberation to accept more suffering. But the thing is that if we're going to resist injustice, and if we're going to step into the world and try to create some level of transformation, whether it's through nonviolent means or through violent means, there's going to be suffering involved. And nonviolence is about acknowledging that suffering is going to be involved and fully accepting it. And once you can accept the suffering that you know is inevitable, it gives you a different relationship to it. Gandhi has a beautiful quote that says, "Nonviolence is a way to make your oppressor see the injustice of their ways through your suffering." So you're sacrificing your own pain and your own suffering and opening your heart up to the world and telling the world that these are the ways in which these systems of violence are hurting me. And opening up that suffering as a way to awaken the moral conscience of the nation, of society, of the person that you're in communication with, and to try to use that moment of humanization to try to trigger some sort of transformation. And that requires us to have a relationship with our heartbrokenness. There's an elder that I've been in relationship with a lot recently named Lenise Pinkard, who says that we need to build a movement that has the courage to have a relationship with our heartbrokenness. That oftentimes when we go out there into the world and we're working on issues of poverty or violence reduction or whatever it is, that we lead with statistics. Like I was just sharing earlier, 70% recidivism rate in the prison system, right? 2.2 million people incarcerated in cages right now. Like, those are really scary numbers to sit with. But for me, what's even scarier is to really sit with the fact that my friend AJ, who just served 19 years in prison and just got found suitable for parole, and just a month ago, we were in tears celebrating the fact that he was going to come home, just received a letter from ICE saying that he's going to be deported as soon as he's released. It's so much easier for me to think of all the statistics than it is to lead with this. Than it is for me to, like, it's so much easier to say, down with the system. The prison system sucks, and these wardens are evil. But for me to say that this system means that AJ is going to be separated from his family, the only family that he has, is heartbreaking. And for me to lead with this means that I need to accept the suffering, the pain that comes up in me every time I think about AJ. And for me to fully accept that to connect with the world in a way that allows the possibility of transformation means that I need to accept that suffering, to fully accept the way that AJ's situation is just ripping my heart apart right now. Part of how I try to live into that suffering and to that heartbreak is to also keep in mind the fifth principle of nonviolence, which is avoid internal violence of the spirit as well as external physical violence. I've been thinking about AJ a lot lately, and I've been sitting with that heartbreak a lot lately. And if I sit with that too much, it's so easy for me to take that pain and that suffering, and for that suffering to manifest as internal violence of the spirit. And for me to start carrying that pain around and start thinking about how much I hate the system, to think about how much the prison system sucks and how evil these systems of injustice are. And that can manifest as an act of violence that I'm doing to myself. There's, when I was organizing around the shooting of Oscar Grant, one of the quotes that really got me hooked on this idea of nonviolence is when Dr. King said that nonviolence isn't just a refusal to shoot your opponent, it's a refusal to hate them also. And in another quote, he says that, I've chosen to stick with love because hate is too heavy of a burden to bear. And there's another quote that I get from the 12 Steps tradition that says that hating someone is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. That if my heartbreak about what's happening with AJ manifests as hatred towards the person at ICE that made that decision, or manifests as hatred towards the system itself, that does nothing to help AJ. But meanwhile, I'm carrying this heavy burden inside, and I can't be free from that. That is an act of violence that I'm doing to myself. That when we're carrying around hatred for someone else, that person's probably having a wonderful day not even thinking about you. And meanwhile, you can't do anything productive in life because you're committing an act of violence to yourself. And so, I think especially when the harm is so great that it's hard to forgive someone because you feel like forgiveness might lift a burden from the person that harmed you, and they don't deserve that. But forgiveness is an act that you do for yourself so that you can be liberated from that burden. It's not even for the other person. Right? When you're harboring resentment or a sense of isolation or any of these emotions that weigh us down, it's how we harm ourselves. And so nonviolence, again, isn't just about protesting and demonstrating and not punching people, but it's about understanding how much violence am I carrying in my own heart every day. And what are the spiritual practices, the communal practices that we can do to unburden ourselves from that? I'll share one more story from a friend of mine, Raphael, who is currently serving another life sentence for a homicide he committed. He's in San Quentin State Prison. And I have his permission to share his story. 20 years ago, he was at a baseball game with his friends, and he said he was having a wonderful day. He was having an awesome day. And after the baseball game was over, he was sitting in his car in the parking lot waiting to go home, and he hadn't started his car yet. And a complete stranger walked past his car and brushed up against it. And he got out of his car and ended up stabbing and killing a complete stranger over that minor little incident. He said he was having a wonderful day and went from having a wonderful day to killing a complete stranger over this. And I asked him what was happening in that moment, and he said, well, 2 weeks prior to that, I had shot somebody, and the person that I had shot had survived. So I knew that that guy was coming after me, so I was on edge and scared for my life those entire 2 weeks. But that level of violence had become so normalized to him that he didn't even realize that he was scared. And in the culture of toxic masculinity, there was no way for him to name, hey, I'm scared right now. Right? And so part of the work of nonviolence is waking up in the morning every day and really being truthful with ourselves of, like, what's my level of internal violence that I'm carrying today? And proceeding with our day based on some awareness of where we are in each and every moment. And as much as these stories are all, really difficult to think about and to talk about, the sixth and final principle of Kingian nonviolence is that the universe is on the side of justice. And this is one that can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. And it's understandably a principle that we get a lot of pushback on. Like, if the universe is on the side of justice, then why do we see so much poverty? Then why is AJ getting deported when he's one of the most compassionate people I've ever met? If you do a Google image search for the word justice, the image that comes to mind most prominently are the scales of balance. Because the concept of justice isn't about what's good and what's bad, because those are relative. That the idea of justice is about balance. And when we look at this principle in that light, then I think we see plenty of evidence that the universe is on the side of justice. The fact that AJ is getting deported to me is evidence that the universe is just. The fact that there's rises in homelessness, to me, is evidence that the universe is on the side of justice. Every time a young person gets shot and killed in the streets of Oakland, that is evidence to me that the universe is on the side of justice. Because I look at all of the ways in which our society invests into systems of violence. We know the prison system has a 76% recidivism rate, and yet we keep investing in it. We invest in war. We invest in policies that perpetuate poverty. We invest in broken school systems and broken policing systems. We make all these investments in systems of violence, and then when the universe gives us the return on those investments, we act like something is wrong with the universe. When as a society, that's all we've been investing in. So as long as we invest in systems of harm, then it is balance, it is the order of the universe that we see some of those returns. And similarly, we have to have faith that if we can begin to invest more into systems of care and systems of relationship and systems of peace and systems of understanding, then the same order of the universe, the same balance of the universe will begin to give us those returns. I want to close with one last story here. There's, in the work that I do all the time, we get these questions a lot about, well, isn't violence just part of human nature? And like, you look at the history of humankind and there's always been balance. So what do you mean you're trying to create a more nonviolent world? Like, it's just part of who we are. And I used to grapple with that question until a while ago I met a friend named Paul Chappell. And Paul says that every study that has ever been conducted on the nature of violence shows that violence is traumatic. That even without experiencing it directly, just witnessing violence can cause trauma, PTSD, anxiety, depression, physical health ailments. And he says if violence is part of our nature, then why does it break our brains? Like, if violence is part of our nature, then shouldn't we be able to engage in violence without it short-circuiting our brains? And he says to him that that is actually evidence that violence is not part of our nature. That our truest nature as a species, as human beings, not as like meditation practitioners or leftists or activists or people committed to social change, but as a species, that our nature is not to be in harmful relationships with each other. That our truest nature at our most fundamental level is one in which we're in right relationship with each other. When we're in loving relationships with each other. The things that fulfill our potential as human beings is to be in community. And so for me, nonviolence is this unwavering faith in the core of who we are as a species, that we are a loving, relational creature. And that moving towards beloved community means always, constantly, never-ending steps towards that direction. And so I've learned over the years that nonviolence is a lot more than learning how to commit acts of civil disobedience without throwing a punch or without throwing a Molotov cocktail. That it is a commitment to a lifestyle, there is a commitment to spiritual practice, there is a commitment to each other, and it is a commitment always to walk in the world, to work in a way that heals relationships. So thank you all for having me, and I look forward to continued discussions in the future.
Thank you everyone for participating. I think we have been extremely fortunate. Over the course of this speaker series, we've often come to these talks not expecting what are we going to hear and what is going to be the takeaway. And speakers have shared their nuggets of wisdom, experience, emotion, and certainly touched something within us. And as I was listening to Kazu today, I was trying to connect the dots. Hurt people hurt people. Hurt hearts hurt hearts. And then we're all about the heart. And then we keep saying, using one of the anecdotes of our guiding principles, love all he loves. I think when we listen to words such as tolerance, non-violence, we had probably not seen a perspective that Kazu shared today. And suddenly we find these words very weak in their description. It's almost a call for inaction rather than doing something about it. Perhaps words like tenderness, compassion will call for more action in the way we behave, in the way we participate when we see situations, when we see moments around us. So probably the takeaway lessons are a little more closer to the hearts at the end of today's session. And I want to extend a heartfelt gratitude for taking the time to come, be with us, and share your experiences. Please accept a small token of appreciation from us. Please. Thank you.